Hello, everyone. I'm back. More history content once again. If you're wondering why am I doing this again, I'm re-uploading this video, which I did a few months ago back in April. I just realized when I look on my video about the life of George the First, I just realized it didn't get a lot of views. So I would just say that, so I would just be like, okay, this needs more views. So what I'm just doing is I'm re-uploading some of my old videos that I've done in the past. I have been doing a lot more videos and that. I need to reach 300 subs before the end of this year because I want to do a 300 sub special. There is going to be a hint about what I'm doing for a 300 sub special. Just a little reminder, in my last video, we talked about Sophia of Hanover, the mother of George the First. I think in my next video, I'm going to do the father of his father, which is Ernest Augustus. Some people say Ernest Augustus. It is kind of weird, and I don't like how to say like that. I already say Ernest Augustus. But every time when I say that word, it always comes up with the first Roman emperor. I don't even understand the Roman emperor. Like, for some reason, I never mentioned the Roman emperor's name before. I think I mentioned it in 2 of my videos, which is very, very annoying because I hate it so much. But yeah, I did my information about George the First. We know he was German because when he was born in Hanover, he couldn't speak a word of English. He refused to learn the language. But when he had his coronation, he spoke in Latin. So Latin is like really weird Latin. And during this time, there was one Baroque composer who lived throughout 2 reigns before dying at the end of his son's reign. And we get to know the friend of Sophia's friend. Their friendship lasted until her death anyway. Yeah. So with this out of the way, I'm going to get started. It's going to be very long because how many portraits are going to be mentioned in there. So let's get started. George the First of Great Britain. George the First, George Louis, was born on the 28th of May, 1660, until he died on the 11th of June, 1727, was King of Great Britain and Ireland from the 1st of August, 1714, and ruler of the Electorate of Hanover within the Holy Roman Empire from the 23rd of January, 1698, until his death in 1727. He was the first British monarch of the House of Hanover. His portrait from studio of Godfrey Kellner, painted in 1714. King of Great Britain and Ireland, he reigned on the 1st of August 1714 until the 11th of June 1727. His coronation was on the 20th of October 1714. His predecessor was Anne and his successor is George II. Elector of Hanover. He reigned on the 23rd of January 1698 until the 11th of June 1727. His predecessor was Ernest Augustus and his successor is George II. He was born on the 28th of May, 1660, in Hanover, in Brunswick-Lüneburg, in the Holy Roman Empire. He died on the 11th of June, 1727, at the age of 67, in Schloss-Unzenbach, in the Holy Roman Empire. He was buried on the 4th of August, 1727, in Lena Palace in Hanover, but in 1957, his body was later moved to the Herstminion in Hanover. He married his cousin, Sophia Dorothy of Celle, in 1682, but they were married for 12 years until he divorced her in 1694. They had 2 children who survived to adulthood, but he had 3 illegitimate daughters with his mistress, which is going to be mentioned in the video today. His house is Hanover. His father is Ernest Augustus, Elector of Hanover, and his mother is Sophia of the Palatinate. His religion is Protestant. Born in Hanover to Ernest Augustus and Sophia of Hanover, George inherited the titles and lands to the Duchy of Brunswick-Lüneburg from his father and uncles. In 1682, he married his cousin, Sophia Dorothea Psell, with whom he had 2 children. He also had 3 daughters with his mistress, Marceline von die Schulenburg. George and Sophia Dorothea divorced in 1694. A succession of European wars expanded George's German domains during his lifetime. He was ratified as Prince Elector of Hanover in 1708. As the senior Protestant descendant of his great-grandfather, James VI and First, George inherited the British throne following the deaths in 1714 of his mother Sophia and his second cousin Anne, Queen of Great Britain. Jacobites attempted but failed to depose George and replace him with James Francis Edward Stuart, Anne's Catholic half-brother. During George's reign, the powers of the monarchy diminished, and Britain began a transition to the modern system of cabinet government led by a prime minister. Towards the end of his reign, actual political power was held by Robert Walpole, now recognized as Britain's first de facto prime minister. George died of a stroke on a journey to his native Hanover, where he was buried. He was the most recent British monarch to be buried outside the United Kingdom. His early life. George was born on the 28th of May, 1660, in the city of Hanover, in the Duchy of Brunswick-Lüneburg, and in the Holy Roman Empire. By the way, Hanover was in the Holy Roman Empire, by the way. At the time. He was the eldest son of Ernest Augustus, Duke of Brunswick-Lüneburg, and his wife, Sophia of the Palatinate. Sophia was the granddaughter of King James I of England, through her mother, Elizabeth Stuart, Queen of Bohemia. For the first year of his life, George was the only heir to the German territories of his father and 3 childless uncles. George's brother, Frederick Augustus, was born in 1661, and the 2 boys, known respectively by the family as Gorgen and Gaschen, that's German for their names anyway, were brought up together. In 1662, the family moved to Unzenbach, where Ernest Augustus was appointed ruler of the Prince-Bishopric of Unzenbach, while his older brother and George's uncle, George William, ruled in Hanover. They lived in Ironburg Castle outside the city until 1673, when they moved to the newly completed Schloss Unzenbach. The parents were absent for almost a year, from 1664 to 1665, during a long convalescent holiday in Italy. But Sophia corresponded regularly with her son's governors and took a great interest in their upbringing, even more so upon her return. Sophia bore Ernest Augustus another 4 sons and a daughter. In her letters, Sophia describes George as a responsible, conscientious child who set an example to his younger brothers and sister. By 1675, George's eldest uncle had died without issue, but his remaining 2 uncles had married, putting George's inheritance in geopatry, for his uncle's estates might pass to their own sons were they to have any instead of to George. George's father took him hunting and riding and introduced him to military matters, mindful of his uncertain future. Ernest Augustus took the 15-year-old George on campaign in the Franco-Dutch War with the deliberate purpose of testing and training his son in battle. In 1679, another uncle died unexpectedly without sons, and Ernest Augustus became reigning Duke of Katlenburg-Gottingen with his capital at Hanover. George's surviving uncle, George William of Celle, had married his mistress in order to legitimize his only daughter, Sophia Dorothea, but looked unlikely to have any further children. Under Salitic law, where inheritance of territory was restricted to the male line, the succession of George and his brothers to the territories of their father and uncle now seemed secure. In 1682, the family agreed to adopt the principle of primogeniture, meaning George would inherit all the territory and not have to share it with his brothers. His marriage. George, in 1680, aged 20, when he was Prince of Hanover, after a painting by Godfrey Kellner. I could not pronounce this stupid artist. In 1682, George married Sophia Dorothea Psell, the daughter of his uncle George William, thereby securing additional incomes that would have been outside Salitic laws. This marriage of state was arranged primarily to ensure a healthy annual income and assisted the eventual unification of Hanover and Celle. His mother at first opposed the marriage because she looked down on Sophia Dorothea's mother, Eleanor, who came from lower French nobility. And because she was concerned by Sophia Dorothea's legitimate status, she was eventually won over by the advantages inherent in the marriage. In 1683, George and his brother Frederick Augustus served in the Great Turkish War at the Battle of Vienna, and Sophia Dorothea bore George a son, George Augustus. The following year, Frederick Augustus was informed of the adoption of primogeniture, meaning he would no longer receive part of his father's territory as he had expected. This led to a breach between Frederick Augustus and his father and between the brothers that lasted until his death in battle in 1690. With the imminent formation of a single Hanoverian state and the Hanoverians' continuing contributions to the empire's wars, Ernest Augustus was made an elector of the Holy Roman Empire in 1692. George's prospects were now better than ever as the sole heir to his father's electorate and his uncle's duchy. Sophia Dorothea had a second child, a daughter named after her, in 1687, but there were no other pregnancies. The couple became estranged. George preferred the company of his mistress, Musseline von de Schulenburg, and Sophia Dorothea had her own romance with the Swedish Count, Philip Christoph von Königsmark. Threatened with the scandal of an elopement, the Hanoverian court, including George's brothers and mother, urged the lovers to desist, but to no avail. According to diplomatic sources from Hanover's enemies, in July 1694, the Swedish Count was killed, possibly with George's connivance, and his body thrown into the River Leen, weighed with stones. The murder was claimed to have been committed by 4 of Ernest Augustus' countries, one of whom, Don Niccolo Montalbano, was paid the enormous sum of 150,000 thalers, about 100 times the annual salary of the highest paid minister. Later, rumors supposed that Königsmark was hacked to pieces and buried beneath the Hanover Palace floorboards. However, sources in Hanover itself, including Sophia, denied any knowledge of Königsmark's whereabouts. George's marriage to Sophia Dorothea was dissolved, not on the grounds that either of them had committed adultery, but on the grounds that Sophia Dorothea had abandoned her husband. With her father's agreement, George had Sophia Dorothea imprisoned in Adeline House in her native Celle, where she stayed until she died more than 30 years later. She was denied access to her children and forbidden to remarry, and only allowed to walk unaccompanied within the mansion courtyard. She was, however, endowed with an income, established and servants, and allowed to ride in a carriage outside her castle under supervision. Musseline von de Schulenburg acted as George's hostess openly from 1698 until his death, and they had 3 daughters together, born in 1692, 1693, and 1701. Electoral reign. George in 1706, when he was Elector of Hanover, after Juan Leonard Haussmann. Ernest Augustus died on the 23rd of January 1698, leaving all of his territories to George, with the exception of the Prince-Bishopric on Onsenbach, an office he had held since 1661. George thus became Duke of Brunswick-Lüneburg, also known as Hanover after its capital, as well as Archbanner and a Prince-Elector of the Holy Roman Empire. His court in Hanover was graced by many cultural icons, such as the mathematician and philosopher Gottfried Leibniz and the composers George Friedrich Handel and Agostino Steffani. Shortly after George's accession to his paternal duchy, Prince William, Duke of Gloucester, who was second in line to the English and Scottish thrones, died. By the terms of the English Act of Settlement 1701, George's mother Sophia was designated as the heir to the English throne if the then reigning monarch William III and his sister-in-law Anne died without surviving issue. The succession was so designed because Sophia was the closest Protestant relative of the British royal family. 56 Catholics with superior hereditary claims were bypassed. The likelihood of any of them converting to Protestantism for the sake of the succession was remote. Some had already refused. In August 1701, George was invested with the Order of the Garter, and within 6 weeks, the nearest Catholic claimant to the thrones, the former King James II, died. William III died the following March and was succeeded by Anne. Sophia became heiress presumptive to the new Queen of England. Sophia was in her 71st year, 35 years older than Anne, but she was very fit and healthy, and invested time and energy in securing the succession either for herself or for her son. However, it was George who understood the complexities of English politics and constitutional law, which required further acts in 1705 to naturalize Sophia and her heirs as English subjects, and to detail arrangements for the transfer of power through a regency council. In the same year, George's surviving uncle died, and he inherited further German domains, the Principality of Lunenburg-Gablingen, which was centered at Celle. Shortly after George's accession in Hanover, the War of the Spanish Succession from 1701 to 1714 broke out. At issue was the right of Philip, the grandson of King Louis XIV of France, to succeed to the Spanish throne under the terms of King Charles II of Spain's will. The Holy Roman Empire, the United Dutch Provinces, England, Hanover, and many other German states opposed Philip's right to succeed because they feared that the French House of Bourbon would become too powerful if it also controlled Spain. As part of the war effort, George invaded his neighboring state, Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel, which was pro-French, writing out some of the battle orders himself. The invasion succeeded with a few lives lost. As a reward, the pre-Hanoverian extension of the Duchy of Saxe-Lauenburg by George's uncle was recognized by the British and Dutch. In 1706, the Elector of Bavaria was deprived of his offices and titles for siding with Louis against the Empire. The following year, George was invested as an imperial field marshal with command of the imperial army stationed along the Rhine. His tenure was not altogether successful, partly because he was deceived by his ally, the Duke of Marlborough, into the diversionary attack, and partly because Emperor Joseph I appropriated the funds necessary for George's campaign for his own use. Despite this, the German princes thought he was acquainted himself well. In 1708, they formally confirmed George's position as a Prince-Elector in recognition for or because of his service. George did not hold Marlborough's actions against him. He understood they were part of a plan to lure French forces away from the main attack. In 1709, George assigned as Field Marshal, never to go on active service again. In 1710, he was granted the dignity of Arch-Treasurer of the Empire, an office formerly held by the Elector Palatine. The absence of the Elector of Bavaria allowed a reshuffling of offices. The emperor's death in 1711 threatened to destroy the balance of power in the opposite direction, so the war ended in 1713 with the ratification of the Treaty of Uret. Philip was allowed to succeed to the Spanish throne, but removed from the French line of succession, and the Elector of Bavaria was restored. Accession in Great Britain and Ireland. George, around 1714, the same year, his succession as painted by Godfrey Calliner. Through both England and Scotland recognized Anne as their queen, only the Parliament of England had settled on Sophia, Electress of Hanover, as their heir presumptive. The Parliaments of Scotland, the Estates, had not formally settled the succession question for the Scottish throne. In 1703, the Estates passed a bill declaring that their selection for Queen Anne's successor would not be the same individual as the successor to the English throne, unless England guaranteed full freedom to trade to Scottish merchants in England and its colonies. At the first, royal assent was withheld, but the following year, Anne capitulated to the wishes of the Estates, and assent was guaranteed to the bill, which became the Act of Security 1704. In response, the English Parliament passed the Alien Act 1705, which threatened to restrict Anglo-Scottish trade and crippled the Scottish economy if the Estates did not agree to the Hanoverian succession. Eventually, in 1707, both parliaments agreed on a Treaty of Union which united England and Scotland into a single political entity, the Kingdom of Great Britain, and established the rules of succession as laid down by the Acts of Settlement 1701. The Union created the largest free trade area in 18th century Europe. Whig politicians believed Parliament had the right to determine the succession and to bestow it on the nearest Protestant relative of the Queen, while many Tories were more inclined to believe in the hereditary right of the Catholic Stuarts, who were nearer relations. In 1710, George announced that he would succeed in Britain by hereditary right, as the right had been removed from the Stuarts, and he retained it. This declaration was meant to scotch any Whig interpretation that Parliament had given him the kingdom and convince the Tories that he was no upriser. Upriser or something. George's mother, the Electress Sophia, died on the 8th of June, 1714. Do not say the 28th of May because that does not make sense. I just change it up a little bit. It's the 8th of June. 8th of June, 1714, at the age of 83. She had collapsed in the gardens at Herminian after rushing to shelter from a shower of rain. George was now Queen Anne's heir presumptive. He swiftly revised the membership of the Regency Council that would take power after Anne's death, as it was known that Anne's health was failing and politicians in Britain were jostling for power. She suffered a stroke which left her unable to speak and died on the 1st of August, 1714. The list of regents was opened, the members sworn in, and George was proclaimed King of Great Britain and King of Ireland. Partly due to contrary winds which kept him in the Hugh awaiting passage, he did not arrive in Britain until the 18th of September. George was crowned at Westminster Abbey on the 20th of October. His coronation was accompanied by rotting in over 20 towns in England. George mainly lived in Great Britain after 1714, though he visited his home in Hanover in 1716, 1719, 1720, 1723, and 1725. In total, George spent about 1/5 of his reign as king in Germany. A clause in the Act of Settlement that forbade VIII, the British monarch, from leaving the country without Parliament's permission, was enormously repelled in 1716. During all but the first of the king's absences, power was vested in a regency council rather than in his son, George Augustus, Prince of Wales. Oh my god. Wars and Rebellions. George in 1718 by George Fouquet after Godfrey Kenner. Bro, why is there so many portraits of George? Within a year of George's accession, the Whigs won an overwhelming victory in the general election of 1715. Several members of the defeated Tory party sympathized with the Jacobites, who sought to replace George with Anne's Catholic half-brother, James Francis Edward Stuart, called James III and VIII, by his supporters and the Pretender by his opponents. Some disgruntled Tories sided with a Jacobite rebellion, which became known as the 15th. James's supporters, led by Lord Mar, a Scottish nobleman who had previously served as a Secretary of State, instigated rebellion in Scotland, where support of Jacobitism was stronger than in England. The 15th, however, was a dismal failure. Lord Mar's battle plans were poor, and James arrived late with too little money and too few arms. By the end of the year, the rebellion had all but collapsed. In February 1716, facing defeat, James and Lord Mar fled to France. After the rebellion was defeated, although there were some executions and forfeitures, George acted to moderate the government's response, shown leniency, and spent the income from the Fouquet estate on schools for Scotland and paying off part of the national debt. George's distrust of the Tories allied the passing of power to the Whigs. Whigs' dominions grew to be so great under George that the Tories did not return to power for another half century. After the election, the Whig-dominated Parliament passed the Suspension Act 1715, which extended the maximum duration of Parliament to 7 years, although it could be dissolved earlier by the Sovereign. Thus, Whigs already in power could remain in such a position for a greater period of time. After his succession in Great Britain, George's relationship with his son, which had always been poor, worsened. Prince George Augustus encouraged opposition to his father's policies, including measures designed to increase religious freedom in Britain and expanded Hanover's German territories at Sweden's expense. In 1717, the birth of a grandson led to a major quarrel between George and the Prince of Wales. The king supposedly followed custom, appointed the Lord Chamberlain, Thomas Pelham Hollands, the first Duke of Newcastle. And by the way, he was the older brother of Henry Pelham, and they were both became prime ministers. One of them was George II's reign, the other one was George III's reign. As one of the baptismal sponsors of the child, the king was angered when the Prince of Wales, disliking Newcastle, verbally insulted the Duke at the christening, which the Duke misunderstood as a challenge to a duel. The prince was told to leave the royal residence, St. James's Palace. The prince's new home, Leicester House, became a meeting place for the king's political opponents. The king and his son were later reconciled at the instance of Robert Walpole and the desire of the Princess of Wales, who had moved out with her husband but missed her children, who had been left in the king's care. Nevertheless, the father and son were never again on conjugal terms. George was active in directing British foreign policy during his early reign. In 1717, he contributed to the creation of the Triple Alliance, an anti-Spain league composed of Great Britain, France, and the Dutch Republic. In 1718, the Holy Roman Empire was added to the body, which became known as the Quadruple Quadruple Alliance. The subsequent War of the Quadruple Alliance involved the same issue as the War of the Spanish Succession. The 1713 Treaty of Uyet had recognized the grandson of Louis XIV of France, Philip V, as King of Spain on the condition that he gave up his rights to succeed to the French throne. But upon Louis XIV's 1715 death, Philip sought to overturn the treaty. Oh wow. Spain supported a Jacobite-led invasion of Scotland in 1719, but stormy seas allowed only about 300 Spanish troops to reach Scotland. A base was established at Eilean Castle on the west Scottish coast in April, only to be destroyed by British ships a month later. Jacobite attempts to recruit Scottish clansmen yielded a fighting force of only about 1,000 men. The Jacobites were poorly equipped and were easily defeated by British artillery at the Battle of Genshel. The clansmen dispersed into the Highlands and the Spaniards surrendered. The invasion never posed any serious threat to George's government, with the French now fighting against him. Philip's armies fared poorly. As a result, the Spanish and French thrones remained separate. Simultaneously, however, Hanover gained from the resolution of the Great Northern War, which had been caused by rivalry between Sweden and Russia for control of the Baltic. The Swedish territories of Bernum and Vendren were ceded to Hanover in 1719, with Hanover paying Sweden monetary compensation for the loss of territory. Oh, this is sad. Ministries. In Hanover, the king was an absolute monarch. All government expenditure about 50 thalers, between 12 and 13 British pounds. And the appointed of all army officers, all ministers, and even government officials above the level of copyist was his personal control. By contrast, in Great Britain, George had to govern through Parliament. In 1715, when the Whigs came to power, George's chief ministers included Walpole, Lord Townshend, Walpole's brother-in-law, Lord Chapel, Stanhope, and Lord Sunderland. In 1717, Townshend was dismissed and Walpole resigned from the cabinet over disagreements with their colleagues. Stanhope became supreme in foreign affairs and Sunderland the same in domestic matters. Lord Sunderland's power began to wane in 1719. He introduced a peerage bill that attempted to limit the size of the House of Lords by restricting new creations. The measure would solidify Sunderland's control of the House by preventing the creation of opposition peers, but it was defeated after Walpole led opposition to the bill by diverting what was considered the most brilliant speech of his career. Walpole and Townshend were reappointed as ministers the following year, and a new, supposedly unified Whig government formed. Greater problems arose over financial speculation and the management of the national debt. Certain governments' bonds could not be redeemed without the consent of the bondholder and had been issued when interested rates were high. Consequently, even each bond represented a long-term drain on public finances, as bonds were hardly ever redeemed. In 1719, the South Sea Company proposed to take over £31 million, which is 3/5 of the British national debt, by exchanging government securities for stock in the company. The company betrayed Lord Sunderland, George's mistress, Marceline von der Schulenburg, and Lord Stanhope's cousin, Secretary of the Treasury, Charles Stanhope, to support their plan. The company enticed bondholders to convert their high interest redeemable bonds to low interest, easily tradable stocks by offering apparently professional final gains. Company prices rose rapidly. The shares had cost £128 on the 1st of January 1720, but were valued at £500 when the conversion scheme opened in May. On the 24th of June, the price reached a peak of £1,050. The company's success led to speculative flotation of other companies, some of a boneless nature, and the government, in an attempt to suppress their schemes, and with the support of the company, passed the Bubble Act. With the rise in the market now hailed, uncontrolled selling began in August, which caused the stock to plummet to £150 by the end of September. Many individuals, including aristocrats, lost vast sums, and some were completely ruined. George, who had been in Hanover since June, returned to London in November, sooner than he wanted or was usual, at the request of the ministry. The economic crisis, known as the South Sea Bubble, made George and his ministers extremely unpopular. In 1721, Lord Stanhope, thought personally innocent, collapsed and died after a stressful deliberate in the House of Lords, and Lord Sunderland resigned from public office. Sunderland, however, retained a degree of personal influence with George until his sudden death in 1722, allowed the rise of Robert Walpole. Walpole became de facto Prime Minister. Although the title was not formally upheld to him, officially he was First Lord of the Treasury and Chancellor of the Exchequer. His management of the South Sea crisis by reinstalling the debts and arrangements, some compensation helped the return to financial stability. Through Walpole's skillful management of Parliament, George managed to avoid direct implication in the company's financial actions. Claims that George had received free stock as a bribe are not supported by evidence. Indeed, receipts in the Royal Archives showed that he paid for his subscriptions and that he lost money in the crash. Later years, 1720s portraits of George by Georg Wilhelm Lothringen. That reminds me. As requested by Walpole, George received the Order of the Bath in 1725, which established Walpole to reward or gain political supporters by offering them the honour. Walpole became extremely powerful and was largely able to appoint ministers of his own choosing. Unlike his predecessor, Queen Anne, George rarely attended meetings of the cabinet. Most of his communications were in private, and he only exercised substantial influence with respect to British foreign policy. With the aid of Lord Townshend, he arranged for the ratification by Great Britain, France, and Prussia of the Treaty of Hanover, which was designed to counterbalance the Austro-Spanish Treaty of Vienna and protect British trade. George, although increasingly reliant on Walpole, could still have replaced his ministers at will. Walpole was actually afraid of being removed from office towards the end of George I's reign, but such fears were put to an end when George died during his 6th trip to his native Hanover since his accession as king. He suffered a stroke on the road between Dellen and Norren on the 9th of June 1727 and was taken by carriage about 55 miles to the east to the palace of his younger brother Ernest Augustus, Prince Bishop of Onsenbrück, where he died 2 days after arrival in the early hours before dawn on the 11th of June 1727. George I was buried in the chapel of Leland Palace in Hanover, but his remains were moved to the chapel at Helsingin Gardens after World War II. Leland Palace was entirely burnt out as a result of Allied air raids, and the king's remains, along with his parents, were moved to the 19th century mausoleum of King Ernest Augustus in the Balkantrin. George was succeeded by his son, George Augustus, who took the throne as George II. It was widely assumed, even by Walpole for a time, that George II planned to remove Walpole from office, but was dismissed from doing so by his wife, Caroline of Ansbach. However, Walpole commanded a substantial minority in Parliament, and George II had little choice but to retain him or risk ministerial instability. Wow, that was a long video. If you guys did enjoy it, make sure to leave a like and subscribe for more history content.